Before we get started with Chapter 9, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that this chapter is full of terms and breakdowns of terms. So Quizlet will be very useful and helpful for you throughout this chapter because it gives you all of the definitions and it kind of groups them together so that you're able to learn them as a group and remember them when you get ready to take your test. So throughout this little recording, I'm going to make sure that I make reference to the terms that can be clustered together, and hopefully it'll help you learn them together and help you be able to identify them on the test. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So when it comes to language, there are 4 key properties of language. You have symbols, structures, meanings, and generativity. They also have a bonus one that's called displacement. Now, displacement and generativity are defined on your Quizlet, so make sure that you go to your Quizlet and you review what those two mean because those are important to language. When it comes to the structures portion of the language properties, there are 2 different types. You have surface structures and then you have deep structures. And surface structures only focus on the symbols that are being used and then also the order they're being used in. The deep structures focus on the underlying meaning of those structures. So that includes the phonemes, the morphemes, the words, phrases, and sentences. And together these are the combined symbol hierarchy. Okay, so phonemes are basically small groups of sounds that create one big word. So, for instance, if I wanted to break down the word church, I would break it down with the CH would be the ch, the U would be its own phoneme, the R would be its own phoneme, and then the ch at the end of church would be its own phoneme. So, it's literally small units of letters or sounds that make up one big word. Now, when it makes up that one big word, it transitions into a morpheme. Now, the morpheme focuses on creating meaning for a word based on those phonemes. So, morphemes represent meanings, phonemes represent individual sounds. Okay, so 2 terms that you should pay attention to in this portion of the chapter is semantics and syntax. Now, semantics focuses on the structure of how we organize and express meaning through language. It's all about creating meaning and understanding those meanings. Syntax has to do with the rules and how we govern the order of words. So basically, syntax focuses on how we combine words to create a phrase or a sentence. So an example of that would be the differences in how we say certain things in English versus Spanish. So in English, if we wanted to say the banana was yellow, we would put the banana first and we put the color afterwards. But in Spanish, they say yellow banana. So it kind of changes the context in a certain way. But syntax is all about the rules of how that specific language governs the way it combines its words. When it comes to perception in this chapter, there are a number of terms that you'll have to pay attention to. I'll name them off in a minute, but the first thing I want to talk about is the bottom-up process and the top-down process. The bottom-up process focuses on creating perception from the outside in, and the top-down focuses on creating perception from the inside out. So if we're focusing on the bottom-up process, we are basically analyzing what we see. So it's like angles, lines, patterns, anything. And we're combining everything that we see to create our perception of what patterns and letters are. Then if we're using the top-down process, we are basically going off of what we already know and our expectations, and we're allowing that to shape our perception of what the language is or what the letters are. So another thing to note in this chapter is that the bottom-up process is directly related to inductive reasoning, and the top-down process is directly related to deductive reasoning. Those are 2 terms that you should look at your Quizlet and understand and know the difference between those 2. So we're going to move on to some other terms that when it comes to perception. Framing, functional fixedness, imaginal thought, mental representation, divergent thinking, prototypes, pragmatic propositions, and propositional thought. The one thing I want to make sure that I touch on is framing. Now, framing is simply your perspective. It's how you see things. So an example of this would be the quote that says, you either see the glass half empty or you see the glass half full. When it comes to framing, it's simply about how you perceive it and what you see. Functional fixedness is being so focused on the way you're used to doing something that you miss out on new ways to use the function. So it's like being so busy trying to stick to the program that you're not willing to be open to new ways of doing things. That's basically what functional fixedness is. Imaginal thought is pretty much, it consists of images that we can see, hear, and feel in our mind. Imaginal thought is a word that can easily be broken down to try to figure out what the meaning is so that you can break down your answer choices. So when you don't know a word on a test or you don't know what the definition is of a certain term, take a look at the root of the word or break down parts of the word to try to find the meaning of each part of it. This will allow you to be able to eliminate some of your answers from your choices and kind of like pretty much break down the answer. So when you look at the word imaginal, you instantly think of imagination. And that means that, it's something that's in your head. It's something that you can think of, something that you pretty much just came up with or that you can feel and see and hear, but it's not physically in front of you. So that, just knowing that definition alone, you're able to eliminate some of your answers throughout your questions. Another example of this is divergent thinking. Okay, so instead of trying to figure out what divergent thinking is, we're going to break that apart and we're going to just talk about divergent. The first part of divergent is the DIV. I want you to think of different words that has DIV in it and try to figure out what those words mean. For me, when I see divergent, I instantly think of diversity. So I know that diversity means different or all kinds are different. So to me, looking at the root of that word, divergent has to have something to do with something different. And then I see the word thinking, and I know that thinking has a lot to do with what we do in our mindset, how we perceive something, and I know that it has something to do with our mind. So I'll put those two meanings together. So it would be different mind. And the definition of divergent thinking is an idea that is different from the norm. By breaking down the big words, and then finding the root of the word, it's easy for you to be able to figure out what the meaning is of the big word. So take the time to break down those words if you don't understand what those big old words mean, because you can easily eliminate some of those answers in your answer choices and kind of find the answer by a process of elimination. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is concepts. And in language, concepts are mental groupings of similar objects, events, ideas, and people. And when you think about that in language, there are certain terms that go right along with concepts, and that is prototypes, pragmatic propositions, and propositional thought. A prototype is how we decide to categorize or put something in a box based on the resemblance to the prototype. So a prototype is something that we have had reference to before. It's like our image, the image of what we think something looks like, and we categorize that information that we receive when we receive language based on the prototype that we have in our mind already. So when it comes to prototypes, that's how we categorize certain information. Now, when it comes to pragmatic is basically the practical aspects of using language. And an example of that would be if somebody came up to you and said, "Man, I nailed that test." We would instantly separate the nailing and the test because we know that that little phrase represents that person doing well on the test, not them actually nailing the test to the desk. So we basically take the practical meaning out of whatever someone says or a phrase that someone says. And we compartmentalize that or categorize that in our mind and process it and understand exactly what that means. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is propositions. And a proposition is basically a statement that expresses an idea. So it can be literally anything. I could say, TCU is going to a bowl game. Like, we're guaranteed to go to a bowl game. That's a proposition. It can be something like, next week I'm going to go buy me some new J's. That's a proposition. So when you think of a proposition, it's clearly stating an idea or expressing an idea. A statement that expresses an idea. All right. Now, propositional thoughts are thoughts that you create in your head that become statements. So it's just a little flip of the proposition. It's you thinking it first and then making the statement. All right, so let's move on to the next thing. When it comes to language and thinking, we automatically know that problem solving is a big part of that. So there are 4 stages to problem solving. And the first one is interpreting, which has a lot to do with framing and understanding the issue. The second one is generate a hypothesis. So to think of a possible solution or educated guess. The next step, number 3, is testing. It's trying to find the solution, the hypothesis, or seeking to disconfirm one or more of them. So testing is just trying to figure out what the actual answer is. And then number 4 is to evaluate the results. And if you didn't come to a conclusion, you would have to review and revise the steps and try again. Those are the 4 stages of problem solving. IGTE, interpreting, generating a hypothesis, testing, and evaluating the results. When it comes to problem solving, there are 2 issues that come along with it. One of them is fixation, and the second one is confirmation bias. Fixation is not being able to see a problem from a fresh perspective. So basically, you're not able to put yourself in a position to see things from anyone else's point of view. You're so fixated on your own belief system that you're not allowing yourself to see things from anyone else's point of view. Okay, so confirmation bias has to do with a person interpreting the new information they're receiving as a confirmation to the existing beliefs or theories that they already have in their head. So an example of this would be the Erykah Badu song called Tyrone, right? Erykah Badu basically is saying that her boyfriend is horrible. He ain't got no money. He always got his friends over. She always got to feed him. And she associates all of those things with his friends throughout the whole song. So anytime she hears the name Tyrone or meets somebody by the name of Tyrone, it's going to always remind her of that boyfriend that was lazy, that didn't have no money, that always had his friends over, that she had to feed, right? So if she were to meet another person named Tyrone, she would instantly start searching for confirmations of those things that she already knows. So if she knows that her old boyfriend was like that he didn't do anything for her and he was always lazy and didn't have money, she's going to look at that Tyrone as if he's going to do the same thing. And everything that pops out to her will be a confirmation of those things because she's looking for it. So confirmation bias is basically being in a new situation, absorbing information, but being completely focused on the things that you already know exist, or being focused on things that you've experienced that you think will happen again. Confirmation bias is interpreting that information and trying to find confirmations of the things that you already believe. So the next thing I want to talk about is a term called schemas and problem-solving schemas. A problem-solving schema is a mental blueprint or a step-by-step script for selecting information and solving problems. Schemas have everything to do with concepts and categories. It's pretty much absorbing that information and figuring out what category to put it in. So this leads me to the ways that we solve problems. There are 4 different ways that we solve problems: through trial and error, algorithms, insight, and heuristics. The 2 main important strategies to solving problems are algorithms and heuristics. An algorithm is a step-by-step procedure that guarantees a solution. It's usually a mathematical or a chemical formula that's being used, but an algorithm is literally the step-by-step process. It takes a little bit longer than all the other steps, but it's the most certain way to get a solution. So the next step in problem solving is trial and error. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's trying, failing, reassessing, and then trying again. The next one is insight, and it's basically a sudden realization of a problem solution. Now, when it comes to heuristics, it basically is a general problem solving strategy, but there are 2 different parts that you can use to this one. It's means end analysis and the sub goal analysis. The mean ends analysis identifies the difference between the present situation and the goal, and then the sub goal analysis creates steps toward a solution. And so an example of this would be, both of these would be writing an essay and then basically choosing one day to do your research for your essay and then choosing the next day to actually write down your essay. So a sub-goal analysis is basically creating a system to reach the goal, and a means-end analysis is identifying exactly what the differences is between where you're at right now and what you need to do in order to get to that goal. One of the terms in this portion of the chapter is belief perseverance, and this refers to clinging to an initial concept after the basis on which they were formed has been discredited. So it's basically holding on to information that you believe to be true, even though they've already proven that it was wrong. I mean, we all have those family members that never want to admit that they are wrong. And whenever you think of that family member, think of belief perseverance. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about are the levels of categorization. There are 3 different levels to this. There's superordinate, basic, and subordinate. Superordinate is the broadest and least specific category. So whenever you separate your information and you put it in categories, you're basically putting it in like the broadest box that you can find. So for an example, instead of saying fish and chair, you're going to say animal and furniture. You're not being specific when you talk about superordinate. It's very broad and very, very, very basic. And the next level is basic, the basic level of categorization. Now, this section is the most common level, and instead of saying that you have an animal, you're going to say give it more meaning. So it would be a fish, and instead of saying furniture, you would be more specific and say a chair. And the last level is subordinate. Now, this is the most distinguished category. So instead of saying fish, you would name a specific type of fish, which is a trout. And instead of saying a chair, you would name a specific type of chair, which is a rocking chair. And that is the levels of categorization. Okay, so when it comes to this portion of the chapter, you want to make sure that you understand what cognition means, metacognition, and understand the 2 different types of metacognition that exist. Cognition is mental activities that are associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. There are 2 different types of metacognition, and they are metamemory and metacomprehension. Metacognition is basically to understand a concept or not. Like knowing that you understand a concept or not. So when it comes to meta memory and meta comprehension, they are exactly what they sound like. Take off the meta and just look at the very end of the word, and it tells you exactly what they mean. Meta memory is basically the awareness of the memory capabilities that you have. And meta comprehension is being able to determine what you do or do not know. And so the next thing I want to talk to you about is aphasia, Broca's area, and Wernicke's area. And these are all things that you should also know and visit your Quizlet to see more about. The aphasia is basically an impairment to language. This happens when there is damage done to the left hemisphere of the brain. There are two different areas that control language in those areas. So it's Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area focuses on controlling language and speech, and it's located in the left frontal lobe. Wernicke's area controls comprehension and is located in the left temporal lobe. Whenever there is damage to those areas, whenever there's damage in the Broca's area, that means that the individual will not be able to speak correctly or fluently. They'll be able to fully understand what you're asking them, but they won't be able to physically speak or respond to you in the way that we're used to. Wernicke's area controls comprehension, so it controls what we worry about and how we understand what's being said to us. And so if there's an issue with that area, we won't be able to mentally understand what someone is saying, but we'll be able to physically speak. And it tends to never be in the right context because we don't fully understand what someone is saying to us. So Broca's area has to do with controlling language and speech, and Wernicke's area controls comprehension and understanding. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we learn language. So an infant as early as 4 months is able to start recognizing the differences in speech, and they start to read lips, and most importantly, they start matching mouth movements with their sounds, like the A, like the I and the E, and words like that. They start basically making sounds and matching their mouth movements to that. As a result of that, we have to be very, very careful about what we say in front of kids and what we say to them, because around this age, they're developing their receptive language. So that means that they're able to understand what's being said to them and about them. And the crazy thing about this is, with receptive language, they're able to start really just like picking up on certain words and producing their own words based on what they're hearing. So productive language is a byproduct of receptive language. Whatever they're hearing, whatever they're seeing, whatever they are being told, they're going to take that and be able to create their own words based on that. This is when babbling starts to happen. You know, when a baby just starts making all kind of crazy sounds and you can kind of understand what they're saying, but not really. It's this is the stage at 4 months when they start to babble. And honestly, they say that the kid is not even babbling in their own language. They're just uttering various different types of sounds. So when it comes to deaf babies, they start watching their parents sign, and then they start babbling in hand movement in sign language. And about 10 months, the babbling starts to make sense. Like, so at the beginning, they start to observe their parents or whoever it is raising them. And then after that, by the age of 10 months, they start to actually sign things and use their hands in ways that is very effective, and it's very consistent with what the parents are doing. So they say without exposure to other languages, a child will lose the ability to both hear and create particular sounds and tones that aren't part of his or her household language. So, in other words, whatever that kid has been exposed to is exactly what they're going to learn. If a kid has not been exposed to numerous languages, they're going to just pick up on the ones that they're being consistently exposed to. And so this brings me to the one-word stage. This is the stage in speech development formed at about age 1 to 2, during which the child speaks mostly in single words. So they'll start naming things in the house like a dog or a TV. At this age, they start shifting to two-word stage by the age of 2. They start talking in very choppy sentences, and they use words like go car, and they only use the most important words. So one of the terms that you need to pay attention to in this section is telegraphic speech. This is the early speech stage in which a child speaks like a telegram. And one example that I would use is the Star Telegram newspaper. The headline of a newspaper only captures the most important words to try to get your attention. And that's exactly what the kids do when they use telegraphic speech. They only focus on content words, and they remove all of the function words. Another thing that kids start to do is overgeneralize. So overgeneralization is using extra words to express their thoughts, but still showing that they understand the ed represents past tense. So an example of this would be when a kid say, he hit me. It's very incorrect the way that they said it, but it's amazing that they start understanding the tenses. So even though they use extra wording in there, it shows that that kid understands that the ed portion of that word is past tense, which is crazy because they actually understand that without being taught. Another very, very important term for this chapter is critical period. Now, the critical period is the time when a child must be exposed to linguistic influence by the age of 7. If they do not get exposed to language before the age of 7, they will kind of run the risk of never learning the art of language, or they will run the risk of it being extremely difficult for them to learn a new language. Another term that we need to make sure that you understand is fast mapping. Fast mapping is when kids are able to connect words and meanings after being exposed to it one time. The last things I want to talk about in this chapter are the theories that go along with language. The number one is operant conditioning, and the second one is universal grammar. Operant conditioning was created by B.F. Skinner, and he believes that learning is associated with negative and positive reinforcement. So basically, he believes that we're more prone to learn if we have a negative or a positive reinforcement that encourages us to learn. So, for an example, if you're a football player or if you play sports and you're not actively being able to play right now because you don't know the playbook, the negative reinforcement of not being able to play the sport and being on the field will encourage you to consume that playbook a lot quicker and learn it at a higher rate. So B.F. Skinner is basically saying no matter if it's a negative or a positive reinforcement, it's going to help encourage you to learn overall. The issue with this situation is the process of learning language moves extremely quick when it comes to students and kids. Kids learn language at a rapid speed, so this theory would not really work when it comes to language. But when it comes to different scenarios and situations, it could very much so prove a point. But when it comes to language, this does not support language consumption. An example of this would be the one-word process, the two-word process, receptive language, and productive language. These are all examples of how kids learn language at rapid speeds. So this theory would not be a valid theory. The next theory we need to talk about is universal grammar. Universal grammar is by Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky reviewed Skinner's theory, and he completely disagreed with the idea of operant conditioning being the only basis for kids to learn language. So Noam Chomsky believes that we all have a genetic component built inside of us that we are innately born with. What he means by that is that we are pre-wired systems that are just waiting to be exposed to language so that we can absorb it and learn its rules. So my example is the Nintendo gaming system. So when it comes to his theory, we are being referred to as the actual Nintendo system. The Nintendo system represents us as individuals. Now, the gaming system comes with everything that it needs to be able to read any game that's made for its system. It has all the hardware built in, the pre-wires built in, everything. But the game is just a gaming system until it is exposed to an actual game. The game represents the language that we are pre-wired to consume. If we do not have exposure to that language, we will never learn how it works. We will never learn the rules. We will never learn how it is to be ran, or we wouldn't know its procedures. So the issue with this theory is the fact that we need both. We need the LAD, the language acquisition device, and we also need exposure to learning. We need exposure to the language. So Chomsky has a definite he has a definite point when it comes to saying that we are pre-wired systems that can consume language, but without exposure to language, we would never learn the different types of language or learn the grammatical rules to our specific language. So make sure that you go back to your Quizlets and take practice tests and look at the flashcards as much as you possibly can, because this chapter is all about terms and the breakdowns of those terms. There's a couple of theories, not very many in this chapter, but you need to understand and know what these terms mean and the breakdowns of the terms.